I'm Canon Penny Anderson, and I'm delighted to greet you on my first day as rector of St. Christopher's Church in Burlington, Ontario. I want to share with you some questions. These are questions that animate my thinking and shape my approach to our shared ministry. I have some questions, and if you've come looking for a whole lot of answers, this video might leave you a little hungry. That's part of my plan. I want to invite you to a conversation with other people from the church, and maybe some church-adjacent people too. Here's one of my questions. What is Anglican theology at its best? People whose collars don't match the rest of their clothing sometimes say things like, "Our theology is incarnational. The sources for our theology balance one another like a three-legged stool. The way we worship becomes the way we believe." What? This is the moment in the video where we cut to an old-fashioned record player just as the stylus bounces across the grooves in the vinyl and we hear that scratching sound and the lecture ends. I have some theological training, and I sometimes wonder, where do I belong when people are talking that way? So let's back up a couple steps. Anglican theology begins in the middle, in that place where we are already living our lives and already struggling to put our faith into action. One of the things that means is that there is no elevated, dispassionate space from which someone gets to dictate what that looks like. Anglicans don't have a central authority, a magisterium that stands back and tells others what to believe. We do have three starting points that are in conversation. That is the Bible, the tradition of the ways that the church has taught our belief and the way the church has prayed, and human reason. It's radically open to questions, this Anglican theology of ours. Questioning is part of the process, and it's expected. I mentioned that human reason is one of the touch points for our theology. We take scientific inquiry seriously. We take all fields of intellectual inquiry to be one of the things that reflects back on the way that we interpret the Bible and the way that we interact with Christian tradition. The three sources are in conversation with one another. Anglican theology is open to questioning and negotiation. That's part of what makes it living. At its best, Anglican theology happens in the context of a worshiping community where we are open to being nourished by God, to encountering God through word and sacrament. At its best, Anglican theology takes seriously the ways that God comes to us in our own humanity, in the incarnate one. Anglican theology is open to God's inbreaking, to the vivacious, hopeful, strengthening, life-giving presence of God in our midst as we puzzle about our own identity. Anglican theology is living because it happens in the place where God's gracious Spirit dwells. Anglican theology is a living thing because it happens in us. I want to know what you think. How can we avoid simply picking and choosing from among all the theological options so that in the end our theology doesn't simply replicate all the assumptions and the biases that we started with? In other words, how can we be open in our theological thinking to being transformed by the living God? How can we begin to treat the music we make, the gracious expression of our dancers, the visual art that surrounds us, as sources for theological reflection? How can our theology help us to frame a response to the current ecological crisis? How can it enable us to respond well to the call for racial justice in our country? How can we respond to the living conditions of millions of global migrants? How can our theology help us to address the poisonous outcomes of our consumer culture? Our times call for courage. Will you be one of the people who joins the conversation? You can find full details of how to connect to one of our conversations on the church website. I can't wait to talk to you.